Delighted to present this event on behalf of the SASE community and the Women and Gender Forum. And I'm particularly grateful to Elaine Coburn from the University of York, Toronto, where she's the director of the Centre for Feminist Research, who's been a great tour de force in bringing all of this together. And the aim of these salons are essentially to allow us to connect with some of the themes of the conference in Amsterdam around fractious connections, to support a more inclusive community so that we can talk to each other outside of the conference time, and also be more inclusive in meeting a green agenda for people who can't or don't want to get on planes anymore. Hopefully this is a way we can all stay connected. Each person will present a short outline of their perspective on fractious feminism and feminist solidarities. And then, as a suggestion from some of our early career researchers, was that we have breakout rooms. So you will all automatically, magically be zoomed into a little breakout room with half a dozen people, where you get a chance to introduce yourself and talk about some of the themes. Then we're all brought back into the main room where we do a question and answer together. This is essentially to improve some of the sociability despite these digital challenges of our day. And then after the end of all of that, if you want, there's a social space that Jacob at SASE will put a link available. So it's like a big virtual room where you can go and mingle with whoever you want to have a chat with if you want to join us. The last thing to say is the session's been recorded and will be put on YouTube later. So if you don't want to be visible, you keep your camera off, but feel free to share it. And we'll be taking questions. They can be in the chat, or Elaine will chair all of that later. So let me hand over to Elaine Coburn. Thank you so much, Elaine, for organising this. And I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm also looking forward to it, and thanks for allowing me to organize it, Jackie. I really appreciate you taking up that role, and I'd like to thank all of our speakers. I was saying to Professor O'Reilly that it would be nice to have an event like this, and I decided I would just invite the 6 people that I most wanted to listen to, and amazingly all 6 said yes. Rauna, who was scheduled to speak, has sent her paper but was unable to be here at the last minute, so I'll read out her talk. But I'm just grateful to everyone for making time in very busy schedules, and everyone speaking today has a long and illustrious career, and I know we're over solicited, so I'm grateful that all of you have made the time to come and speak today. The idea of this session, which is Fractious Feminisms and Feminist Solidarities, Women and Gender, a Women and Gender Forum event, is again sponsored by SASE, and it brings together leading feminist scholars and researchers to share their insights into how feminisms in their diversity shed new light on economics and political economy, and other disciplines, as we'll find out later today. If mainstream traditions dismiss feminists as fractious, that is, in the Oxford definition of the term fractious, as making trouble and complaining, this panel asserts the usefulness of feminisms for troubling problematic assumptions and critiquing absences within dominant traditions of economics and political economy. Indeed, given significant income and wealth inequities, global conflicts, and climate change, feminisms and feminist solidarities are more necessary than ever before. This panel opens up critical conversations about reimagining economics and political economies in ways that foreground feminist responses to the major concerns of our time. And next, what's going to happen is I'm going to introduce each of the speakers in order. First, Julie Nelson, then I'll read out Rauna Kuokkanen's paper, then Martha Gimenez, then Jayati Ghosh, then Marjorie Griffin Cohen, and then finally Subusisiwe Sibeko before turning to our breakout rooms. Each speaker will have about 12 minutes for their talk. And I'm very pleased to first introduce Julie Nelson, whose work I've used a lot myself. So it's a real pleasure to be introducing her today. Julie Nelson is Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. Her research interests include feminist economics, economic methodology, ecological economics, and ethics in economics. She's the author of many articles, which I'm sure people here are familiar with, in journals ranging from Econometrica to the Journal of Political Economy to Economics and Philosophy, and Hypatia, the Journal of Feminist Philosophy. She's the author of numerous books, including Economics for Humans and Gender and Risk-Taking, Economics, Evidence, and Why the Answer Matters, as well as co-editor with Marianne Ferber of Beyond Economic Man, Feminist Theory in Economics, and Feminist Economics Today. She is the editor of the Business Ethics and Economics section of the Journal of Business Ethics, a former associate editor of Feminist Economics, and she was the 2019 president of the Association for Social Economics. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Julie Nelson.
Hello, I'm grateful to be here. I want to thank Jackie and Elaine for inviting me. Work in feminist economics, which is the field that I come from, has certainly been fractious. We are not well absorbed into the mainstream of the profession, to say the least. We're much marginalized. But I'm going to argue today that at a broader level, some of the insights from feminist work in economics can help reunite aspects of research and study, academic fields that should never have been split apart. And I'm going to be actually reading a paper, which I don't usually do, but I recently wrote something that seemed to be appropriate for this, and I timed it at 12 minutes, which is the allotted time. So here we go. It's quite obvious that everything that characterizes the mainstream discipline of economics aligns with dominant Western essentialist views about men and masculinity. These include its core definitions, subject matters, models, and methods. But rather than argue this point by point, I'm going to just give you a contrast. Consider, for example, and I've got a few slides here, so let me share the first one. The statement of purpose adopted by the Econometric Society in 1930. The society shall operate as a completely disinterested scientific organization. Its main aim shall be to promote studies that aim at the unification of the theoretical quantitative and the empirical quantitative approach to economic problems, and that are penetrated by constructive and rigorous thinking, similar to what has that which has come to dominate in the natural sciences. I find this a little amusing. I think the masculine science tough slant should be pretty obvious. We want to penetrate and dominate too, to summarize this whole thing. The sort of thinking champion in this passage, this was Econometric Society back in the 1930s, but it's come to dominate the profession as a whole in the meantime. Needless to say, such a mechanical model of economic functioning, in which basically physics-like forces are said to determine things, there's no room for actual messy human beings of any gender. Real humans have real feelings, vulnerabilities, biases, interdependencies, nor is there room in this kind of discipline for social institutions in which real issues of communication and conflict may arise. So where did these go? Let's look at, in contrast, a report of the first meeting. Let me see how I'm going to get this going here, of the American Sociological Society, which was later renamed the ASA in 1905, published in 1907. We are convinced that something is lacking in the methods of interpreting human experience, and that the most effective means of supplying the lack must be sought without rather than within the disciplines of history, economics, and political science. The sociologists do not imagine that they are appointed to destroy the vocations of other investigators of society. They feel themselves called to represent factors in the problems of human association, which have thus far received less than their fair share of attention. The society makes no appeal for credit. It simply proposes to encourage sociological inquiry and to await competent judgment of results. The sociologists at the time, at that meeting, were mostly male, but the language of this passage checks off feminine essentialist boxes all down the line. We don't want to offend anyone or get any credit for our work. Perhaps because venturing to study the social behavior of people in businesses and markets might be perceived as encroaching on the turf of economics, destroying their discipline. Sociology in the 20th century ended up being made up of what historian Marion O. Ferber called quote, leftovers: marriage, the family, poverty, crime, education, religion, and sex. In other words, sociology got all the places where we are most obviously needy, where we most obviously don't fit the normative model of behavior, where we are young and vulnerable, where we most obviously ask the big questions about our lives, and where we most intimately connect with each other. And that split between economics and sociology has endured at least until fairly recently. I put together a little table of the organizations that have dared to put words with economy that don't fit that definition from the Econometric Society or that approach. There has been an Association for Social Economics since 1941. This is the one I was president of. It's mostly economists. It's always been quite small. Society for Business Ethics was founded mostly by philosophers, but not until 1980. Business ethics is still considered an oxymoron by a lot of people. We have businesses are mechanical entities. How could they have any normative dimension? Your group, it's a group sponsoring this, one of them, SASE, not founded until 1989. Economic Sociology section of the ASA, not until 2001. And I think it's not coincidental. That's a sociologist for women in society, IAFI, also didn't get founded until fairly late in the 20th century. And Sociologists for Women in Society and a precursor to IAFI, CSWEP, mostly were originally concerned just with women in the profession, only became more feminist later. So these groups, the groups you are involved in, the groups I've been involved in, could straddle this old, what I would argue is imaginary, outdated, and extremely limited separation of the realm of commerce from the realm of social behavior. We could acknowledge that emotions and non-pecuniary goals play roles in business decisions, and recognize the fact that business decisions could even be sometimes motivated by real care about human beings in the future. We could acknowledge that businesses are areas of human relations. We could recognize that our workplaces, and not just departments of philosophy or religion, are locales where we work out, or fail to do so, the big questions about our life and purpose. We could notice that we don't leave our full humanity at the workplace door. And I'd like to point out that such a project is in many ways the mirror image of feminist economists and sociologists' study of care work. Essentialist views of gender tend to sentimentalize activities such as childcare and nursing, seeing them as arising freely from women's natural tendency toward self-sacrifice. Feminist researchers note that these activities involve both caring feelings and real skills and real hard work and use of time and resources. But essentialist views of business and commerce reflect the opposite extreme, toughifying activities such as corporate decision-making and market exchange. We should note that these actual activities in the world, when done well, actually involve both work and an attitude of care as areas of human, social, and not merely mechanical interaction. Good business and market relations demand attention to human vulnerabilities, long-term interests, reputation, and actual effects on well-being. I say that these we could overcome the gap because there are obstacles. One obstacle is the intransigence, or the obstacle as I see it is the intransigence of essentialist economic beliefs among academics on both the right and the left. On the right, the belief is that profit maximization is good because it leads to efficiency. So all that mechanical stuff is good. This is a battle in which feminist economists are particularly engaged, because that's the mainstream of our profession. On the left, the idea is that profit maximization and all of this mechanical functioning is bad because it leads to inequality and oppression. And I would venture to guess that this side is more prevalent in today's gathering. But note that both the right and the left agree on one thing. They agree on the underlying idea that the economy is a soulless machine run by things like extraneous forces like profit maximization. For example, influential sociologist and philosopher Jürgen Habermas asserts that the human life world is in danger of being colonized by mechanical systems of economy and bureaucracy. So some socioeconomic researchers consider capitalism, a monolithic capitalism with a capital C, to be the source of all evil, and consider a more social form of economic life to be possible only in co-ops, worker or publicly owned enterprises, and the like. But the economist's idea that the essence of the firm is to maximize profits did not actually come from the observation of actual businesses. It came from the preferred methodology. It was invented because it's a convenient and clever looking way to represent the firm as a math problem. Maximize profit, where profit is defined as revenue minus cost, subject to constraints on production and markets. This theory of the mechanical economy arose from physics envy, pure and simple. If we look around instead at real economies, rather than believing what economists tell us, we can see that that they all are in fact created by their societies. There are in fact many small c capitalisms, some more toxic and some far less. Neoliberal monopoly capitalism, fossil fuel industry lobbying, we can point to those as extremely toxic areas. But there's also fair trade, small producer, small c capitalism, town market day capitalism, big companies that move conferences away from locations that encourage discrimination, capitalism. Firms and markets, like people of various genders, don't have essences. They are what they do. So I believe that feminists can help everyone lose both gender and economic essentialism. Creating societies, including economies, that promote human and planetary welfare depends on this. I also have some ideas about things that could replace the mechanical metaphor, but I will leave those for breakout groups or discussion. And I got done in 12 minutes and 5 seconds, according to my timer.
Thank you very much for being so exemplary as the beginning speaker, both in content and in timing. Next, I'm going to introduce in her absence, Professor Rauna Kuokkanen. She is unable to be here today, but did share her speech, which I will read out. She's a research professor of Arctic Indigenous Studies at the University of Lapland in Finland, an adjunct professor of Indigenous Studies and Political Science at the University of Toronto. Her research focuses on comparative Indigenous politics and law, Indigenous feminist theory, Arctic governance, and settler colonialism. Her most recent book is Restructuring Relations, Indigenous Self-Determination, Governance and Gender by Oxford University Press, which won the International Studies Association's Feminist Theory and Gender Studies Section Best Book Award. Currently, she leads the SIDA School Project, a community-driven renewal of Sami SIDA system founded by the Kona Foundation. The collaborative project by Sami scholars, artists, and activists seeks to reconstruct and simulate how and which SIDA practices could operate as part of Sami governance structures today. And her talk, which I'm reading out, is entitled, "The Feminist New Green Deal Meets the Challenge of, quote, Just Transition." In my brief talk, Rauna writes, I'm going to discuss what I consider one of the most pressing and difficult feminist policy conundrums vis-a-vis climate change and Indigenous people's rights, in particular the free, prior, and informed consent in relation to green energy transition. As we know, solar and wind energy have been presented as a solution for climate change. The European Commission has established policy initiatives aimed at making Europe climate neutral by 2050. And this has been approved by the European Parliament in 2020 and considered a roadmap to sustainable and resource efficient economies. In energy transition, renewable sources play a pivotal role, and particularly offshore wind production is slated as essential to a just transition to more sustainable economies. In the United States, the Green New Deal resolution was introduced to Congress in 2019. It includes bold and extensive programming, combining climate change mitigation and reducing economic inequality. And in it, the Green New Deal advocates a call for a just transition and a shift to renewable energy by 2030, while countering previous policies that have either ignored or disproportionately harmed disadvantages, communities, or groups in society. Although the resolution was not advanced to the Senate in 2019, the Green New Deal continues to animate the climate and domestic policy discourse, including around economics in the United States. In 2021, in the wake of racial reckoning and the subsequent resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020, the Green New Deal has morphed into a number of initiatives and platforms grounded on intersectionality and calling for racial and climate justice. One is the Red, Black, and Green New Deal that foregrounds the effects of environmental racism in minority communities and proposes to tackle climate change by investing in Black communities and repairing past harms. Other major propositions include the Feminist New Green Deal and the Red Deal by the Red Nation, a coalition of Native and non-Native activists, educators, students, and community organizers advocating Indigenous liberation. Here, writes Rauna, my focus is on the Feminist New Green Deal, which welcomes the basic premise of the New Green Deal, but argues that there is need for a stronger cross-cutting approach. The Feminist New Green Deal further calls for stronger feminist principles and goals to tackle historical oppressions, such as the intergenerational effects of colonialism and anti-Black racism. The Feminist New Green Deal calls for the leadership of women, particularly from disadvantaged communities, as well as Indigenous peoples, people with disabilities, LGBTQIA+ people, people from the Global South, migrant and refugees communities, and youth. The Feminist New Green Deal outlines 10 principles of engagement, ranging from mainstreaming intersectional gender analysis, confronting institutional patriarchy and racism, centering Indigenous rights, such as free, prior, and informed consent, confronting unsustainable and exploitative systems of production, advancing reproductive justice, promoting local democracy and decision-making, and recreating regenerative feminist economies. The Principle 8 calls for rejecting false and harmful responses and solutions to climate change that, quote, fail to address root causes and enable drivers of climate crisis to keep going while greenwashing their damages. These include carbon trading, capture and storage, biofuels, atomic power plants, natural gas extraction, mega dams, geoengineering, and bioenergy. These techno fixes permit industries to pay to pollute, displace smallholder and subsistence farmers, the Feminist Green New Deal writes, destroy biodiversity, food sovereignty, and livelihoods. Overall, the Feminist Green New Deal's goals are laudable and welcome, considering the deeply ingrained hegemonic masculinity in the dominant climate change discourse, evident in technical solutions, progress narratives of controlling the future, the language of distant scientific objectivity, efficiency and performance, and even militaristic muscle flexing. In my view, however, there is a major unaddressed contradiction in the Feminist Green New Deal. On the one hand, the deal calls for a swift and just energy transition. On the other, it demands, quote, binding legal recognition of Indigenous land rights, real enforcement of the vital framework of free, prior, and informed consent. And Rauna Cohen goes on to describe what she calls the Nordic context. In 2020, wind energy construction was booming in Norway. Over 100 wind industry initiatives have been granted permits by the Norwegian government, and nearly half have been constructed. According to a recent report, wind energy construction represents the biggest ever encroachment into the environment in the country's history. The encroachment has been very rapid, with new actors and often unsystematic regulations and procedures. About half of the wind energy in both Norway and Sweden is taking place in the areas central to reindeer herding, largely without the free, prior, and informed consent of the Sami people. Cases where reindeer herding districts have agreed to wind energy and development in their pastures fall into two main categories. Those who were first to be confronted with the wind industry and did not perceive the full scope of its impacts, and those who felt they would not be able to stop the entry and would be better off agreeing to construction rather than going through involuntary expropriation. Many of those who did not know the full impact have regretted their actions later. In a number of cases, the wind development has ended up being considerably larger scale than initially planned. In regions with no previous wind industry, unexpected consequences have arisen that were not foreseen. In still others, many wind energy developments have been given licenses to expand their operations. Wind energy is not as environmentally friendly as being commonly suggested, Rauna continues, particularly when preserving biodiversity and conserving ecosystems and habitats. This applies both to where raw materials for wind turbines, rotors, cables, and generators are extracted and where they are installed. Wind industry on its own is extremely area intensive. When considering the entire industrial system involved, roads and other infrastructures, the scale is even more sizable. When installed in remote, previously uninhabited areas, roads and infrastructures need to be built on the site damage ecosystems, draining marshland, for instance, and scar the land. In the Salir districts of the Trom regions, Sami women and reindeer herder Ristin Turi Alexanderson points to the energy consumption and the CO2 footprint of the construction of wind energy. During construction, there is a lot of traffic of heavy machinery and detonations, creating excessive noise, bright lights, and dust. The cement foundations of the average 70-meter tall towers require several meter deep chambers that are either excavated by diggers or detonated. According to Alexanderson, the continuous construction traffic, including trucks delivering 50,000 liters of diesel per week to the site for several months, have been incredibly disruptive to reindeer livelihood. As 68 wind turbines and a service road have been completed, her family and others in the districts have lost large tracts of their winter pastures and calving areas. Wind turbines emit distinctive noise generated by the machinery and rotation of the blades through the air. The turbines also emit low frequency infrasound, the effects of which on humans or animal health are not yet systematically studied. According to one study from Finland, 15% of the residents living in the vicinity of wind turbines, that is within 2.5 kilometers, reported symptoms with infrasound. The cause for the symptoms, however, have not been conclusively established. Counter to industry arguments of the coexistence of reindeer and wind industry, studies show that wind turbines in operation frighten the reindeer, whether the sound, movement, or shadows of the turbines on the terrain, and that the roads present an impediment for movement. When reindeer see moving blades, they usually turn away, which means that pastures on the other sides of development are not used, putting more pressure on diminishing pastures. Wind turbines are also expensive to operate and last shorter than many other energy generators. The turbines also occasionally break or set fire. Once in operation, the 50-meter long rotating blades kill birds and insects. In winter, the blades may freeze, followed by a loosening off of ice that pose danger to wildlife and humans alike. Regulations regarding the disposal or recycling of rotors and other materials after their lifespan are lacking. This has led to simply leaving discarded blades on the ground. The intrusion of various forms of development has resulted in the loss of pastures and/or the closure of migration routes. Restrictions and closures of migration routes may result in the loss of reindeer, particularly during the spring migration before calving. With the diminishing pastures, there's greater likelihood of herds moving to pastures belonging to the neighboring districts and merging with other herds. This in turn leads to increased work for reindeer herders and interference on the land, such as additional roundup, herding, or erecting fences. It also often leads to increased conflict between different Sami communities and districts. What I argue is that in the scramble to address the climate crisis, reindeer indeed appears to have become the new buffalo. In the 19th century in the United States, the buffalo was sacrificed for the industrialization of the new nation and for gaining full access to the land the plains people governed. The practice of reindeer herding is currently being sacrificed for the clean energy transition. In both cases, the sacrifice is driven by policies and legislation informed directly or indirectly by manifest destiny, the core ideology of settler colonialism, according to which indigenous peoples and their livelihood are seen as perpetually disappearing as part of the natural law of progress. Yet, as the past and present examples demonstrate, the disappearance is actively and continuously pursued by settler colonialism and its logic of elimination. In the plains, the buffalo was nearly exterminated because the central authorities deliberately turned a blind eye to calls to prevent the slaughter. Today, the authorities in Norway turn a blind eye to calls to prevent the elimination of already fragmented reindeer pastures. The settler colonial idea of vanishing indigenous peoples has never ceased. It may shapeshift into contemporary expressions of giving way, among others. In the climate crisis era, it's manifest through neoliberal market solutions and as, quote, the price we have to pay in building a carbon neutral society. To conclude, as broad policy frameworks, the Green Deals do not explicitly advance manifest destiny ideologies, but they also do not reject them. While the feminist New Green Deal repudiates false or harmful climate change responses and solutions and demands binding recognition of Indigenous land rights, including the enforcement of norm of free, prior, and informed consent, it nevertheless calls for a, quote, swift and just energy transition. This article has shown the difficulty of squaring these conflicting goals in Sami reindeer herding. The Green Deals, including the intersectional feminist New Green Deal, continue to disregard this reality of conflicting policy objectives and the ways in which they are inextricably linked to past policymaking and racist ideologies that continue to animate contemporary legislators. Such an oversight is not due to ignorance, but rather a combination of refusal and incapability to tackle and engage with settler colonialism and the ways in which it informs the basic premises of contemporary societies and economies. And that concludes Rauna Cohen's contribution. So taking to task the feminist New Green Deal of economics on the grounds of Sami Indigenous self-determination, particularly with respect to reindeer herding. Next, I'm going to introduce Martha Gimenez. Sorry, it's hard when you're playing several roles. Martha Gimenez is originally from Argentina. She is Professor Emerita in Sociology at the University of Colorado in Boulder. She has written on the political economy of population, Marxist feminist theory, social reproduction, and the political constructions of race, ethnicity, and gender. Her work has been published in journals including Science and Society, the Review of Radical Political Economics, Gender and Society, Das Argument, Aktuell Marx, and her book, among her books, she has published Marx, Women, and Capitalist Social Reproduction by Brill in 2019. And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Martha Gimenez. Welcome.
Again, I will say thank you for inviting me. It's my second gathering of scholars since I retired almost 15 years ago. I have a paper that I will proceed to read as clearly as I can. It is called Feminism, Class and Identity, Ideological and Political Implications. My contribution to this panel explores some problematic aspects in feminist perspectives and their unanticipated ideological and political effects. I am a sociologist, not an economist. In my work, I have sought to learn and apply Marx's methodology to identify the historically specific capitalist determinants of social phenomena, including the oppression of women. In this process, I learned from feminist theories and research findings. They illuminate the effects of capitalism on women and other disadvantaged sectors of the population. Many feminists have used historical materialism to critique social science assumptions and develop their own analysis of the oppression of women. However, the relationship between feminism and historical materialism continues to be difficult. My observations are not linked to specific theories or authors. They are intended to point out, from the standpoint of historical materialism, some problematic implications of Western feminism based on the different theoretical and political assumptions underlying Marxism and most feminist theories. From a Marxist standpoint, it is important to differentiate between two levels of analysis: the capitalist mode of production and social formations where the capitalist mode of production dominates in various ways. To put this matter differently, it is the difference between capitalism, the form of economic organization and domination theorized in Capital, and its historical manifestations. Class structure, relations, and contradictions are identified at the level of the mode of production. Social formations differ in the extent to which classes are politically organized, the existence of relative importance of racial, ethnic, and other social divisions, the balance of power between classes, whether class is part of the acceptable political discourse, etc. It is the mode of production that sets the parameters within which different social formations change through time, as their capitalist classes pursue their own political and economic interests. Though critical of social science assumptions, stereotypes, and silences about women and other oppressed groups, some feminist theories appear to conflate the capitalist mode of production with the capitalist economy within a given society or social formation. Consequently, the place of class in feminist thinking remains uncertain. The determinant role of class is difficult to conceptualize if one's theoretical assumptions preclude the distinction between those levels of analysis and the study of their articulation manifests through the effects of class relations over the working class access to its conditions of social reproduction. Capital is a social relation between classes, those who own the means of production and those who must survive, who must labor to survive. That social formations differ in the empirical composition of each class does not change their underlying class dynamics, contradictions, and exploitation inherent in class relations, which affect the context within which classes are reproduced daily and generationally. Here, the important point is that unemployment and the presence of a economy of labor are inherent features of capitalism. This is why the material conditions of social reproduction are never assured for the entire working class. The material conditions for the inequality between male and female workers rest on the articulation between capitalist modes of production and social reproduction, which affect all workers, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, etc. But the whole working class, male and female, is oppressed by capital, and the relationship between male and female oppression may vary quite markedly from time to time and place to place. Calling attention to the interrelation between production and reproduction and the ways household formation, family size, fertility, migration, domestic relations, gender relations, etc., are shaped by class relations and the balance of power between classes would illuminate the complexity of the factors affecting all working class people, regardless of gender and membership in other oppressed population aggregates. The left and African American women criticize the early feminist tendency to theorize about the oppression of women as if all women share similar experiences. The outcome, the race, gender, and class perspective, eventually called intersectionality, place class on the same level of analysis as other identities and sources of oppression. However, class is not an identity, but an objective social relation present in all capitalist social formations. Class relations, struggles, and contradictions are a potential source of qualitative change in the mode of production. Oppressive relations and identities, gender, race, ethnicity, citizenship status, etc., are historically specific. They reflect the politics, ideologies, stereotypes, biases, etc., about population aggregates and their members dominant in a given social formation at a given time. Changes in oppressive relations and in individuals' socioeconomic status leave the mode of production unchanged. Location in the working class increases the likelihood of experiencing oppression. Members of the capitalist class and upper income strata are in a qualitatively different situation. Successful feminist struggles for social policies and rights that ameliorate the oppression of women and open opportunities to them are very important for their well-being. However, they leave the material conditions of their oppression unchanged. As Marx pointed out in the essay on the Jewish question, the legal abolition of barriers against equality leaves intact the material conditions that produce those barriers. As a result, the progressive social policies and civil rights victories, individual women and members of other oppressed groups may attain better working conditions and experience upward mobility. However, the conditions of the majority does not change. Of course, feminism is necessary, especially under current conditions. A feminist critique of political economy, pointing out the determinate nature of class relations and processes affecting all working people, might eventually generate important critical discourses. If a class analysis of oppression were to become widespread, it could potentially weaken the tendency to attribute the problems people face only or primarily to the effect of oppressive ideologies and relations and the identities produced by those ideologies. While racism, sexism are real, they have ideological functions when they are wielded as the main causes of oppression. Identity-based conflicts thrive when the network of material relations within which life unfolds under capitalism is rendered invisible by the reduction of class to an identity, a prejudice, or a form of reductionism. The current historical context necessitates the end of the retreat from class that started over half a century ago. The return to class will not happen overnight and depends on material conditions upon which feminists have no control. We can further such return by starting from the articulation of production and reproduction within capitalism, exploring their effects on the lives of working class people as opportunities for employment and advancement open and close for reasons outside their control. A return to class would entail, paraphrasing Marx, differentiating between the material changes in the conditions of economic organization and production, which continuously produce upheavals and uncertainties in the lives of all working people, and the ideological forms in which people become conscious of those changes and organize politically to struggle. Today, the dominant form of consciousness through which the average person experiences and becomes aware of the effects of capitalism on their lives is identity politics. I worry that the identity categories we feminists continue to use unwittingly contribute to the strength of identity politics and the individualism that characterizes the dominant ideologies in capitalist societies. Nevertheless, and paraphrasing Gramsci, feminists should combine pessimism of the intellect with optimism of the will and reject the retreat from class. Thank you.
Maybe we will have fractious feminisms because we have semi-self-determination and a call for return to kind of more classical Marxist understandings of political economy. The next talk will be with Professor Jayati Ghosh, who has taught economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi for nearly 35 years. She is currently professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst in the United States. She's the author, she's authored or edited more than 20 books and more than 200 scholarly articles. Among them, her recent books include The Making of a Catastrophe, COVID-19 and the Indian Economy, When Governments Fail, COVID-19 in the Economy, and Women Workers in the Informal Economy, among many others. She's consulted for a variety of international organizations, including the ILO, the UNDP, the UNCTAD, UN Women, and she's a member of several international boards and commissions, including the United Nations High-Level Advisory Board on Economic and Social Affairs. In May 2022, she was invited to join the United Nations Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism, mandated to provide a vision for international cooperation to deal with current and future challenges. In addition to her scholarly work, she writes regularly for popular media like newspapers, journals, and blogs. And with that, I would like to invite Professor Ghosh to speak.
Thank you so much, Elaine, and thank you really for inviting me to this fascinating conversation. I have to say it's getting more fascinating all the time, and there's so much that I would like to delve in more deeply with all the previous speakers. So it's great to be part of this. I don't have a prepared paper, which I'm now thinking is a good thing because there's a lot I would like to respond to, but there are some ideas that I sort of came with. So let me just put them out. And some of them are really taking off from Julie's really excellent intervention in the beginning. And some I think are more in the category of responses. So I was thinking about your title, Fractious Feminisms. And I was thinking, okay, what is it exactly that makes feminism so fractious for economics? I mean, why do we make so much trouble? Why are we so troublesome to the discipline? And why, therefore, are we still so marginal, really, to the discipline, despite, I would say, growing efforts to sort of push our way in, thin end of the wedge strategies? I think it's basically on 4 different levels. I think Julie already emphasized very beautifully in the beginning how it undermines the conceptual underpinnings, if you like, the very philosophical underpinnings of economics. Particularly if you take the standard mainstream economics, it undermines the conceptual underpinnings of microeconomics for sure. Rational economic man, the utilitarian principle, the possessive individualism. Because once you recognize that things like unpaid work, care work exist, I mean, they could not exist if you were really entirely operating on the utilitarian principle based on possessive individualism. And therefore, it's not surprising that it's rational economic man, because the rationality of doing care work that provides unpaid work that really contributes to someone else's utility is simply not possible. It wouldn't exist. The care economy would not exist in that framework. So I think that's one big area of where it is undermining and therefore fractious. But I think it also shows very significant flaws in the standard macroeconomic understanding, because once again, I'm really taking unpaid labor as the key thing here. Okay, if you take unpaid labor, you recognize that once again, the care economy subsidizes and enables the recognized economy in ways that play very significant roles in accumulation processes under capitalism, in strategies of development, in the ways in which cyclical fluctuations are dealt with, in the patterns of migration nationally and internationally, in all kinds of processes that are seen as macroeconomic, but have hugely varying patterns depending on the gender construction of different societies and depending on the way in which these gender relations are used in different accumulation strategies, depending on the colonial, neo-colonial, semi-colonial patterns that are also playing out in gendered ways in different economies. So, for example, it's not just that the care economy subsidizes the recognized economy. The very fact of its existence, the very fact that so much of this work and so many workers, therefore, are not recognized, completely alters the validity of the notion of productivity, per worker productivity, which is typically seen as one of the important measures for all economists. Mainstream, heterodox, everybody looks at productivity per worker. If you recognize that the numerator GDP is flawed, measuring a whole bunch of things, but not measuring the value of things which are intrinsic to maintaining society, valuing, on the other hand, things which are in many ways detrimental to society, not just financial bubbles and so on, but also all the extraneous things that come with pollution and so on, and destruction of nature and so on. But you also recognize that the denominator is wrongly measured. The denominator doesn't mention or calculate the unpaid workers. So notions of productivity per worker are also completely messed up, but they're really not valid. They're not proper indications of human progress in any significant way. Similarly, all kinds of other macroeconomic strategies of accumulation. In India, much is made of the fact that the first 2 decades of this century saw India emerge, so to speak, on the global stage as a major economic performer. And whether in terms of, significantly expanded role in the global economy or productivity increases in terms of workers per GDP per worker and so on. And yet this is the period where official recognized work participation of women declined in India. we fell from an already very low share of women's recognized work participation of 36% of working age women to a low of around 15%. In fact, in the most recent estimates, it's as low as 11%, unbelievably low women's recognized workforce participation, not because women have stopped working, but because there's a shift from employment, paid employment, to unpaid work. And that is telling you that it's a whole different strategy of accumulation. It is not what has been typically observed in a lot of the today's developed advanced economies or in Southeast Asia, East Asia, and elsewhere. So you have very, very different models and strategies of accumulation depending on the nature of the use of unpaid labor, depending on the nature of women's integration into economies, which is completely missed out by most approaches to the macroeconomy. And of course, this leads to the third way in which we are fractious, where feminism, a feminist perspective, creates trouble for standard approaches, which is in the whole realm of policymaking. I won't anymore accept that economic policymaking is gender blind. I think that's a sort of fallacy we all fell for a while. It's not gender blind, it is gender exploitative. It recognizes these differences. It recognizes how the gender construction of society enables unpaid labor to persist in huge ways. And that in turn means that economic policies can exploit that. Austerity is fundamentally based on the notion that a significant part of essential activities, care work, etc., will be undertaken within households if they are not provided by state and public policy. And so austerity typically relies on pushing a lot of these activities onto households and therefore onto unpaid labor largely performed by women. Cyclical fluctuations are dealt with in the same way. I mentioned the economic strategy in India, which has extended into public policy to the point where, because so much of women's work is unpaid, you can also underpay when you do recognize them as workers. So the entire health program, the child nutrition program, the maternal reproductive programs, all of these are utilizing women who are not even classified as workers, but as volunteers. So you don't even have to pay them the minimum wage. They're paid a fraction of the minimum wage in public policy. So in a sense, the fractious, the perspective that comes from feminist economics destroys all the central standard notions of micro, macro, and economic policy within the discipline. And I think that's why it is seen as so inherently problematic still by the mainstream. But, you know, in a way, I do believe, and here I think, Martha, I would love to have a further discussion with you. I do believe that you have to incorporate a feminist perspective in the class perspective, because, you know, it's not something which is specific to capitalism. The control over labor power, which is ultimately the fundamental issue, that's really what all this gender construction in a purely materialist, you know, the very economically determinist way, the control over labor power is absolutely central. And it is that ability of the gender construction of societies to control the women of labor, to control the labor of women, which is such an important underlying feature that determines how particular capitalisms evolve. But it also has, let's face it, affected, you know, patriarchy through history. It's not a question of something that came up with private property, as we were all taught with Engels and so on. It actually predates all of that. In fact, you could even argue that that particular oppression of women laid the foundations for other forms of exploitation of other people's labor. If you like, maybe the causation was even the other way around in terms of, you know, how exactly societies can ensure that certain kinds of labor are always performed and always extracted from others. Finally, I think I just want to mention that while feminism is deeply fractious in a very positive way for these standard disciplines, I think fractiousness within feminism is very fruitful and productive also. And here I actually do want to say that there is something very positive about this focus on intersectionality. I agree with you. I completely agree with Martha that, you know, an overemphasis on identity politics is not just distracting, it can even be misleading because it can lead you away from these fundamental concerns. But the lack of recognition of how social differentiation plays out in labor market segmentation, in the control of labor power, I think that is something that is very, very critical. And similarly, within feminism, the facts of how different kinds of social differentiation play out in many, many other ways. I think that's something that we have to contend with and be aware of and benefit from. So I actually welcome a lot of further fractiousness even within our feminism, because I think all of that is likely to generate much more productive intellectual activity.
Genitive versions of fractiousness. Maybe we'll hold on to that for when we get into the small groups and then the larger groups for discussion. Next, I'm very pleased to invite Professor Marjorie Cohen to speak. Professor Griffin Cohen is a feminist economist and professor emeritus at Simon Fraser University. She's written extensively in the areas of political economy and public policy. Among her many books are Climate Change and Gender in Rich Countries, Work, Public Policy and Action, Remapping Gender in the New Global Order, Training the Excluded for Work, Canadians' Women's Issues in 2 volumes, and for instance, Free Trade and the Future of Women's Work. Professor Cohen was instrumental in establishing the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives in British Columbia, and she was its first chair. She has served on numerous government boards and commissions. Most recently, she was the first chair of the British Columbia Fair Wages Commission. Her feminist activity has been considerable, including being vice president and treasurer of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women. And among the many awards she has received are the Charles Taylor Prize for Excellence in Policy Research and the Galbraith Prize in Economics and Social Justice. Her most recent focus is on the care economy, and I believe that that is what she's speaking to today. So I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Marjorie Cohen.
I'm really pleased to be here today and to meet all of these wonderful women who I've been reading for years and years and who I have not spoken to individually. So this is a real pleasure. And also I want to thank Elaine and Jacqueline. I actually am going to read my paper because basically I had to write it out to make it really clear in my mind what I was thinking about this. So that's why I did it. I think other people will recognize that problem. So today I'm going to focus on the care economy in the context of talk about productivity and growth. So my main point is that despite the centrality of the care economy during the pandemic, planning for post-pandemic recovery in too many places pivots away from seriously addressing care issues. So I particularly want to talk about productivity and its prominence in current economic analysis and public policy, and particularly how its relationship to economic growth undermines care issues and public policy decisions. My focus will be on wealthy countries primarily because this is the area that I know best. The pandemic required massive spending on the part of governments to keep the economy from collapsing. Businesses needed subsidies, workers' income, and various aspects of the care economy, especially healthcare sectors, required a lot more public money. The kinds of objectives about government debt and deficit that previously were so effective in spreading austerity were set aside. And during the pandemic, this occurred very much in the way that austerity was ignored during the financial crisis of 2008. This is when vast sums of money for governments were injected into the financial sector to keep the system from falling and collapsing. As is well known, the pandemic exposed the tremendous deficiencies in the care sector in rich countries. It also exposed the problems with the labor involved in care, basically how there simply is not enough of it and how poorly paid it is for certain groups of caregivers. The evidence is terrible. In Canada, we had the highest death rates among rich countries and long-term care institutions. That's what we call institutions for people who are elderly and infirm. It was as high as 80% of the total deaths in the initial periods of the pandemic. The thought that this could not possibly happen again and things had to change has now quietly been sidestepped as the economy returns to normal. Interest in the care economy as a major focus is once again and quite unbelievably subsiding, and usually by using the economic threats of the past that were so effective in promotion of the austerity government. But this time there does seem to be a difference. Where at one time the focus was on ruinous debt and deficit, this no longer takes center stage, although of course it still waits in the wings. The public spending necessary to deal with the pandemic crisis demonstrated that government spending and action in the name of protecting people can indeed be tolerated and can in fact strengthen the economy. At least in my country, debt and deficit does not have the same kind of rallying potential that it used to have. Now, curtailing needed spending in the public sector on care relies on other concepts related to the health of the economy. The new fear buttons are inflation, productivity, innovation, and economic growth. The financial and corporate public influencers are hard at work at lobbying governments and appearing frequently in the media to show that productivity, which affects economic growth, will be seriously compromised unless specific government directives and support are given for certain sectors of the economy. These messages are strongly supported by the intellectual gatekeepers and corporate institutions, major credit agencies, business groups, academic economists, and so on. Once again, the implication that is that all public spending on care issues is almost pure cost, paid for by those sectors of the economy primarily responsible for productivity and economic growth. The productive growth sectors are specifically identified as high technology, energy, resources, manufacturing, and especially sectors that focus on exports. Export-led growth is consistently resurrected as the most productive and logical avenue for government corporate support. There's much to say on all of these issues, but I want to look at what constitutes a productive sector of the economy and how this relates to what is considered most significant for economic growth. Now, low and declining rates of productivity are considered a problem across rich countries, with a specific focus on labor productivity. Labor productivity is usually understood and measured in terms of gross domestic product per employed person or per hour worked. Labor productivity usually is understood to increase when labor has more capital to work with. And of course, as economists always show in the textbooks, the person with the shovel isn't as productive as the person with the backhoe. So then, as the argument goes, low labor productivity is a result of low capital investment, with the stated obvious solution being that capital needs to be wooed to invest more. This then brings about public policy preferences for low taxes and increased subsidies to specific corporate growth sectors. All of these preferred measures are, of course, at the expense of government spending on care. In fact, the care sector is perceived as a drag on the economy because it is a sector with very low measured productivity. The reality is that what constitutes economic activity changed dramatically over the past 100 years, and traditional economic concepts and measurements simply are inadequate for recognizing the change. Labor now looks really different and is not mostly related to the production of actual physical things, but to the production of services. Productivity as originally measured does not work for care sectors within services. When things are produced, measuring increases in the relationships between inputs and outputs is easy, but it does not translate well to services. Now, there are many different kinds of services that make up the service sector, but significant for our understanding of the problem regarding productivity is the significance of the services that make up the care sector. If we consider health and education alone, it normally makes up around 18 to 20% of the GDP of rich countries. Recently, education spending dropped during the pandemic because of reductions in teaching, but presumably that will resume. But the point is that care services, which can also include aspects of housing, public transportation, employment supports, are a huge portion of the economy. But this is the problem. Service productivity is fundamentally different from making things. And basically, economists haven't progressed much more than counting how much is paid for the service as the output in the sector. This is particularly problematic when considering government-provided services such as healthcare and education, where in most rich countries, except the US, market prices for the services do not provide a way of seeing if productivity is improving. The current practice is to make the output of service equal to the total cost government pays. Clearly, with this approach, there is no productivity gained at all, since output equals the input. With rising cost of care services and no corresponding improvement in productivity, the care sector is viewed as an unproductive sector, and the spending on care then is, by definition, a drag on the economy, actively lowering GDP per hour's work. In the post-pandemic period, challenging the notion that care services are unproductive is important because in a way it informs government actions. When government market rating agencies call on government to improve productivity in order to spur economic growth, they want investment in tangible things, traditional infrastructure like highways and bridges, or in areas of innovation like high technology, or in increasing exports. And in my country, Canada, this means supporting the oil and gas sector and other resource sectors. These private sector activities are perceived to be the sectors that pay for public programs through their productivity and through their taxes. I want to give you examples how productivity is treated in our media and by our government here. And this is in relationship to our recent federal budget, the discourse on the recent federal budget. Our main newspaper said Canada will struggle to increase real GDP per capita over 2020 to 2030 because of feeble expected growth in labor productivity. And this is by a business group, the major business group. Unfortunately, the current decade is not an aberration. The OECD also sees Canada posting the weakest real GDP growth among all advanced countries over 2030 to 2060. The main reason is, again, disappointing productivity growth. Now, this is really extraordinary. I mean, the OECD did say that, and it is amazing that they're anticipating growth from 2030 to 2060. Well, we don't even know what it's going to be within the next year, but that's beside the point. So feminists have long been at the center of critiques of what traditional capitalist economics understood as being significant activity. Currently, some very good work shows that the care sector is not only a significant part of the economy, but investment in this sector can make the economy perform better. Here's two good recent examples. Hanau and Himmelway convincingly show that a care-led recovery would have significantly superior employment outcomes than recovery led by what is usually the leader in recovery, construction sector. In Canada, a major support for the beginnings of a national universal childcare program was much influenced by the work of many economists that showed that one province that had universal inexpensive childcare, that's Quebec, had very large increases in female employment, and the resulting tax and economic benefits meant the system did not require increases in taxes to pay for child care. This convinced policymakers that scaling it up nationally would not negatively affect government finances and would increase economic growth. These examples work because they directly deal with the labor impact of investment in the care sector. More specific work can and should be done to expand these kind of analyses. Associated with this problem with understanding productivity is that these aspects of public sector are absent from GDP accounting, and altogether GDP is significantly underestimated because of the lack of output of these output measures. In addition, we also need to shift the way productivity is counted in the care sector, that is beyond just labor. The most obvious problem is in healthcare, which has been noticed for a long, long time, where there are measurable changes in outcomes. It's just that they're not easily equated to monetary gains. Take, for example, the increase in lifespan over time. It's been enormous. In Canada, it increased 14 and a half years from 1950s to now. So now we have an average of 83 years. This is significant, especially because the older years are now periods of much better health for most people as well. What is most important is that the economic data significantly underestimates the real output of the healthcare sector. We could similarly show better outcomes with improved attention to services in long-term care facilities, early education and childcare, and all levels of education. Feminists have long noted the inadequacy of the GDP as an appropriate measure of total economic activity and well-being, and that's been discussed here today as well. For purposes of economic forecasting and planning by governments, it is especially inadequate because what GDP does in its growth in GDP, it does not reflect anything more than changes in productivity. And it is especially limited notion of what constitutes productivity. As has been frequently noted, its limitations, well known, are seldom presented to the general public. They are not recognized by governments, and they're not all that prominent in academic papers. So in ending, I just want to say, ask the question of, is how productivity and therefore economic growth defined really important, or is it just something we as feminists have to work around as we have? I argue that it's crucial for understanding that a different kind of future is possible, one where economic growth is not a dirty word, and I'm thinking here of the environment, and the economy could grow if the care sector were truly understood for its role in improving not only social welfare, but also economic productivity and its relationship to economic growth. But that's all more work to be done in the future.
Thank you for that very much, Marjorie. It was really wonderful and gave us, concrete ways of thinking through actions and not just speaking in the sometimes small world of kind of scholarly work in the academy. Next, I'd like to invite Subusisiwe Sibeko to speak. She is an economist and researcher. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Economics from Duke University and a Master's in the Political Economy and Development from the University of London. Her research focuses on macroeconomic policy, including participatory feminist budgeting. She was the co-chair of the Budget Justice Coalition, which is comprised of more than 14 civil society organizations, where she provided research support for the Labour constituency. She authored The Cost of Austerity, Lessons for South Africa, and she's also the co-author of A Fiscal Stimulus for South Africa. In 2020, Buzi was featured in the Roundtable series of renowned economists on rebirthing the global economy to deliver sustainable development by the United Nations Secretary General. She considers herself a feminist political economist in training, and she is determined to be part of the unwinding of structural injustices. So welcome, Buzi. We're very interested in hearing your talk.
No, thank you so much. With all these great inputs, I feel like I should be asking questions and letting it, moving it over. But, thank you for inviting me to this. It made me think and reflect a lot on feminist political economy or feminist economics, or the ways in which, people try to distinguish themselves, within this broad umbrella of feminist economics in the sphere itself, which I think, by definition, that really that makes it hard, I think, in different spheres. So I want to start by saying one of the problems in economics is the discussion of the economy in abstraction, right? This idea that there's the economy here, and then there are people somewhere, we don't know where, but the people are there, but the economy is in itself something that is so large and so impenetrable that we cannot really discuss without really just quantifying it. And that is the only way to speak of this economy. But in the role that I am in now, I'm getting into this habit of reminding people that when you look out of the window, that is the economy. We are part of the economy in our day-to-day living. And so I thought, what is it about feminist economics that was interesting to me, or why I got into it, was really to say that it is about taking seriously historical, social and economic processes. And in a country like South Africa, it is almost like we're having to step back and say, how do we really diagnose the problem? Are we all on the same page about what has happened to our country, to the people in it? And have we come to terms with that? Because without acknowledging the past, there's no way of moving forward, because continuously what is happening is that everybody's understanding of the economy is based on from wherever they come from, ideologies. And so when you are in public platforms in South Africa, people will say you're becoming too ideological. But fundamentally, ideology shapes the way that you understand the problem. And what we are facing here is really that people understand the problem differently. And what has happened is that there's a paralysis because it seems so overwhelming that there's so many views about the economy, that we just reproduce what is existing, right? So we continue on with the neoliberal economic framework. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about, and just wanted to say, I agree with Martha. I think the important thing about, talking from a class perspective is very, very important. But I also want to add this question of why have certain identities been important at different times? So yes, the class analysis is central, but to understand why is it, that gender, sexuality in this day and age, whereas, in a different time, something else was important. And this is on a continuum, right? It's a longitudinal process in which these identities are changing. And I think it is critical to understand why, and at that point, why was it important that, race, for example, was a critical distinguishing factor between groups of people. And so, I prefer to call it racialized capitalism and patriarchy, because I do think, that there's a significance to me about raising the race issue, particularly in a country like South Africa, where neutrality is being preferred. But neutrality is really at the expense of Black people, even if we look at it in a class perspective. And so I just wanted to share as well from a paper that I've recently written with Dawn, which was about social protection, and to say that, one of the challenges I think in feminist political economy or feminist economics is how do we substantively meet people's material needs now? I'm not talking about the future, about how we can reconstruct the economy. I'm talking about right now. COVID has hit, and how do we respond? We've got all this great literature, we've got all this great understanding of the world, but it is very, I always get that word wrong, but it's very contested what needs to happen. And so in the South African context, what you found is that people have proposed a universal basic income grant, which of course, feminist economists have said we need non-commodified ways of existence. We need public sectors that provide, housing and so forth, and on and on. But at the same time, I found that the issue of a universal basic income grant is quite debated heavily in feminist economic circles. And of course, understandably, it comes from the place of if you give everyone the same amount of money, $100, it doesn't necessarily challenge the power dimensions that have occurred between those people, right? Between genders, between age groups and so forth. But then also, but it's been challenging because as a person who's spoken about a UPIG in global platforms is acknowledging that in our country, corruption is such a significant factor that the minute you add gender as a distinguishing factor about who should get what, you're going to lose masses of money through the fiscus, because what's going to happen is people are going to find ways and means to not follow the law. And so the question is about how do we bridge the policy and the literature, or how we understand what is best that needs to be done in our various contexts. And of course, this has been challenging because people need their material needs met today. I don't have a year to go and research what is the best social protection system to ensure that equitably and it challenges the diversity amongst households, that it challenges the inequality within the household, that it considers inter-household relations, that it considers the longitudinal processes, which are critical to the understanding of a household itself. But how do we respond to the now? And I think, one feminist economist raised this, which I thought was quite profound. She said, we need to meet people's material needs and we need to capture their imaginations. And systematically, I've thought about this question, people, when you bring feminist economics on the ground to the people, and to me, the question is always how decolonized, again, this is a different question, how decolonized is our feminist economics in itself? When we think about different countries and how we apply our knowledge, is it a decolonized perspective that we are applying to that specific case? And so how do we think about the local global connections in those particular spaces? I know there's been a lot that's been said, so I've had to rearrange my input because I didn't want to repeat too much what people have already said, but to really lastly say that what has been important, or what is important about the feminist political economy outlook is really the linkages between the macro, meso, and micro levels. And so in within the South African context, what is happening is that people are anti-grants, which are, money being given to households, because they see it as lost money. It goes back to that question of productivity. It's almost like a black hole is swallowing up this money, and the economy is just, it's never going to happen. But really, feminist political economy is saying, how do we understand, how that money within that household is utilized, right? And those intra-household, inequalities, who gets the money, as a critical question. Some policymakers have proposed a family grant, which would be really detrimental in our context, knowing fully well that the unequal power within households, within genders, within generations, right? We've got intergenerational households, and the genders are, split in particular ways. And so how do we think about that money that goes into a household, and how it feeds back to the fiscus, how it feeds back to how we socially produce those households, how it feeds back to productivity in itself, people's ability to be able to apply for jobs. And I hate reducing these sort of measures to the economic outputs, because I do generally believe that the other outputs are actually far more important than quantifying that if I give you R1, you will then generate a fiscal multiplier of 1.2. I actually think, there are many other arguments to be made, but to really say that is what feminist political economy enables us to do. But the challenge, again, continues to be in various spaces, and especially where there are few of us, the various ways in which we understand the world become really challenging to challenge, or a barrier in a way to challenging the status quo at higher levels, because of this inconsistency of how we understand the historical, social, and political processes that lead us to where we are today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And for reminding us that economies are always kind of historical, historically in the present contextualized, not just in the context of gendered injustice, but also racial injustices, and then figuring out what that means in terms of concrete policy actions for the here and the now. Next, I think one of the SASE administrators asked if they could do a quick poll. So I'll invite them to do that quick poll. And then immediately after that, we'll go into our breakout room so we can discuss together. Then we'll come back briefly as a larger group, and then we'll conclude the event. But I'd like to really thank all of the speakers for their contributions today, certainly extremely varied. So we saw some of the diversity of feminist thoughts and thinking about economics from a range of feminist lenses. And I hope that this will stimulate an interesting discussion for everyone in the small groups afterwards. And also thank you to everyone for patience with my tendency to speed talk and mispronounce words in English and in French when I'm speaking in French. So people ask where the work is. Many of these, someone asked in the chat where these speakers' writing is. If you just look at people's last names and first names, all of the people who are speaking here today have written many, many, many scholarly articles and books. So whether you're an academic or not, I would say just if you're an academic, maybe just put their names into Google Scholar and hundreds of articles each. And if you're not an academic, then if you go to your local bookstore and put in their names, all of them have written extensively on feminist economics, and should be quite easy to find.
Does anybody want to, Yongchu, do you want to ask that question? Should we catch it, and then we can, if you want to move into the separate rooms?
I'm not an expert in economic area, but
I can't see you. Where would you like to open your camera, and then you can ask your question yourself then? Yeah, and would you like to introduce yourself as well?
My name is Yeonju Cho. I'm a faculty at UT Tyler in Texas, USA. And then I'm a feminist, but I'm not familiar with economic and sociological approaches. I'm a professor in human resource development, but I have conducted research on women in leadership for the past decade. So what I'm doing right now is I have been active debunking the problems and issues and challenges we face in Asian and countries in Korea. But now I'm more focused on what to do to move forward. So I'd like to hear from your different perspectives on on the topic. Thank you.
Annie, did you want to add to what Yeonju said? If you want to open your camera and introduce yourself as well, you're very welcome to, so everybody gets a chance to have their voices heard. Did you have anything you want to add to it?
I don't have anything to add to it. I just, I think it's a great question, and it always, all the speakers have presented. I should say also, I'm not an academic. I'm not an economist. I'm a feminist priestess, in fact. So I'm coming from the lens of spirituality and thinking about, patriarchy in spiritual community. And so all of this is like lots to chew on for me. And I'm always interested in, what are the visions that we can hold to carry us forward? The speakers have raised really interesting issues, and I love that they, the piece, each of you, what you've shared speaks to each other. There's a really interesting weaving happening. And so I really appreciate this question, because I don't want to just leave here with like, okay, well, there's a lot that we can be worried about. There's a lot that we can be struggling with and wrestling with. And so this question of like, well, what can we take from this that we can bring then back into our communities, into our work, into our lives, and maybe, into bigger and other questions as well, so that we can actually affect change and see a different world as we move forward.
Shall I hand back to Elaine then to manage our panel's comments on those questions?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I just invite any of our panelists who would like to speak to this question. I mean, I think some did, kind of try and enter quite directly into the question of where to move. For instance, Professor Cohen talked about the ways in which we might, really rethink the care economy and move away from kind of the scaremongering around inflation and an obsession with productivity narrowly defined, to think about new ways of understanding what is productive and what contributes to well-being. So that might, I don't know if Marjorie, you want to speak to that. And then Boozy actually talked about some very specific measures and how these can be taken in fruitful ways. And I see Julie's hand is up. So yeah, go ahead, Marjorie, and then Julie next. Yeah.
Thanks very much for giving me a chance to be first on this, Elaine. It's a very interesting question, and I think it's a particularly complex one, because we're all feminists on so many different levels. That is, we're academics, and all of us here are academics, but also we are activists. And so we do act in different areas, and we can't act in all of them. So that's the complexity of it all. So partially, it's the ideas that we hear from each other in sessions like this that gets us stimulated around both writing and both how we move forward. Institutions are very, collective. I don't mean institutions in the grand sense, but groups of feminists acting together, even if it's as few as two together, are incredibly important. Like very recently, I started a small group called the Care Economy.ca, and we've been able to actually work together amazingly by across great distances, and connect with other people who are dealing with the care economy. So it's a lot to, there's everything to do. And people working together around what is immediate is incredibly important. But I think, as Martha brought out, thinking the big picture as well is just as significant. We have to keep the large issues in mind, and that we do have class distinctions which are extraordinary that we cannot ignore.
Yeah, we're certainly living at a time of incredible kind of wealth and economic inequality. Every year they publish, like the 10 or 11 billionaires who are worth, quote, half of humanity. And that's certainly a major question that feminists have to look at and seek to answer. So next we had Julie, then Jayati, then Boozy. I'm just going in the order that I saw the hands. And then we'll ask Martha to contribute as well. So Julie next.
Yeah, I will be fairly brief. I mean, the general answer I usually give to that question is a quote from somebody, I can't remember who, about find the place where your great passion meets the world's great need. That is, where the angle that I'm going in at something might not at all be the angle that somebody else wants to go in. So we've heard everything from how do we meet people's material needs today, to pretty high level abstract academic stuff. And my stuff was more on the abstract side. But I do think in terms of a vision to work for, I would urge what I would call pragmatic kinds of visions rather than utopian visions. We can all dream of what the world would be like if everybody would just believe the same thing that I do and act in the same way that I do. Those can be motivating, but you end up working with a very small group of people who think like you, and even that may split. So, which is why, why I talk about the fact that, I mean, I think like for gender, decreasing gender oppression and for climate change issues and the rest, we really need all hands on deck. So we can't think of some utopian state, some utopian cooperative society, some utopian all business society, some utopian thing modeled on a patriarchal family, the way that some, none of those on its own is going to come to pass. So what can we do that is not tied into some belief or idea that is very limited? And if you can find that, and I think it's great, like working in spirituality. The group that I'm in is dealing with yet another sexual predation by a male clergy member sort of issue. So these things we fight on all fronts.
Yes, unfortunately, that's too familiar, that story. Next, we have Jayati, and then we'll have Buzi, and then we'll ask Martha to say a few words.
Okay, thanks a lot, Elaine. Just, I don't normally do this, but it's Jayati, not Jayati. Okay, just. Okay.
Thank you, Jayati. Thank you. I will get
No,
it.
not Jayati, Jayati.
Jayati.
Yes, thank you. Okay, yeah, so I want to just second what Julie said. We have to fight on all fronts. We have to do whatever we can in different ways, because these are all different forms of oppression, exploitation, and unsustainability, which are coming together in our lives, which doesn't mean that it's so impossible that we have to just go back home and go to bed, because it's the challenges are too immense. I think I put in the chat the UN Women brought out, I think, a really pretty good feminist plan, which covers different contexts and situations. What you do in Korea will obviously have to be very different from the kinds of things we're fighting for, let's say, in India or Brazil or the US or Canada. So definitely there are national issues, but there are also regional and international issues. There are the ways in which the global economy forces particular kinds of things, whether it is austerity in countries that are facing financial crisis, or it is patterns of migration that affect how women get involved in the global value chain of care and all of that. So it's not that there is only one thing to do. There are many, many different things to do. And in that, it's really important to have coalitions. So I think one thing that we have to do as feminists is be willing to work with all kinds of different groups, including groups that we don't always agree with on everything else. We need to find as many coalitions as possible, because the problems are too urgent, too pressing, and too otherwise intractable, because you're facing really, really strong power imbalances. And so, what is the way forward? I think all of us know, number one, what kind of society we would like to see, and two, what are the basic elements of the building blocks of that society and economy. I think pretty much there is a lot of agreement on that. Where you position yourself in any particular one of these struggles, I think depends very much on context. And Julie put it beautifully, right? Your own passions and capacity and so on relative to that. So yeah, I would say whatever you can, wherever you can, as much as you can. Yeah.
Thank you. Next we have Buzi to speak a few words.
Yeah, I'm glad that people have raised that, because I think, to me, one of the most important things is understanding that the mainstream has established itself as sort of an elite sport, right? So only the economists can be consulted about the debt issue. And so, there's a word from the Rethinking Economics book, and it says econocracy. And so how do we break the econocracy? How do we make whatever we've discussed here, how do we make it accessible to more people than in this room? Because in the end, we create these elite little groups that are great, international, but the knowledge sits here within these smaller groups. So how do we actively work towards that? I think another critical thing from the experiences from South Africa's activism space is to say, what has been a successful campaign in your country? So in South Africa, one of the most successful campaigns has been the Treatment Action Campaign, which was advocating for free ARVs in the country. And when I look at them, why were they successful? It's precisely because of this bottom-up, top-down approach. There were people taking the state up to a constitutional challenge in the courts. There were people on the ground marching for ARVs. There were people in between writing about the need for ARVs, op-eds, academic papers, research, and so forth. And so how do we build, you know, and there has to be a synergy, because it's happening now. We are all loosely doing this work in our different spheres. But how do we make it such that there's synergy between these groups and we are working collectively, as opposed to everyone is just doing the little things where, you know, where they can. So being more deliberate about that. I know it's very difficult because, you know, it requires coordination at a massive scale. I don't think there's been a protest or action that large in South Africa since the Treatment Action Campaign, which is a very long time ago now, over a decade ago. And I think the last thing I want to say is being proactive. I do think that, you know, even in the South African context, we were reactive to say the grants are excluding caregivers. You know, we didn't first say government should provide grants to caregivers. And so we were reacting to a process that has already gone along. And so the question is, especially for those of us who work in policy spaces, is how do we think about proactive as opposed to reactive proposals, you know, in our work itself?
Thank you very much. Martha, would you like to say a few words to conclude? And then I think we will conclude this session and people can go off and continue these conversations wherever they are. But I'd like to thank everyone. Martha, would you just like to say a few words or answer?
I think it's a question very difficult to answer, particularly coming from someone like me that has been retired for a long time. But my answer, as well as the paper I presented, is grounded in the reality that we live here today in this country, when after 50 years, women's rights, reproductive rights are under threat again. And I feel that as feminists, and that not just as feminists, that all people struggling against oppression are like that character I'm trying, was it Sisyphus with a rock, pushing the rock up, and then the rock comes back and it has to, you know, it goes over and over. Up and down, and in a sense, it's a lesson on the limitations of what we can achieve in the context of the political arena in which we are able to act. And so, without losing hope, I think that we have to get involved in, as Julie said, you know, in the groups that call your passion, in whatever it is that you can do. And basically, I would say that for us feminists, without using so much focusing on policies of care, because I look at things as questions of reproduction. But anyway, the kind of things that we do as women in churches or with our friends, in our groups, in our coalitions, that kind of behavior, to me, it has enormous potential because it shows an alternative to a transactional behavior based on productivity, or I wouldn't say productivity, but based on a kind of transactional analysis that presumably everybody conducts. You know, I do this for you, but you do that for me. And caring is giving without return, in the sense of just doing it because it has to be done. And I would just like us to remind us all about the way that under capitalism, you know, the human needs are at the bottom. Capitalism is about profit, exploitation, and how we, in the future, whatever future utopian society comes, whichever way we name it, it will be a society where needs come first, where care comes first, where love comes first, where the fulfillment of all the human needs that we have today, that we have to struggle for, come first. And so it would be like a complete reverse in the structuring of how the economy works, okay, where education and self-creation and joy and so on would take over. But that would take, I don't know, we will not be alive when that happens. But then if we reminded that goal, we can understand how in all the contradictions of this society, there are the spaces of hope, like David Harvey called them, the spaces of hope, where people's interactions with each other can lead to a better world eventually. But in the meantime, we also have to be aware that we operate under very strict limits. And that's the lesson that in the US we are learning today. It's not just what its theoretical sociologist points out, it's happening. Thank you.
Thank you once again to all of our speakers. We'll have to go. I myself have another talk at 1 o'clock somewhere else. So I'd just like to thank once again SASE. Thanks very much, Jacob, for all your kind of behind the scenes support. Thanks very much, Jacqueline and Riley. Thanks to all the panelists. Thanks to everyone for coming and listening and engaging. And we hope you have some wonderful feminist conversations in the future, wherever you are. So thanks very much for just a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are.